there are those little birds called ortolan buntings. They're very, very little. They're about yay big. And they're greyish-green, they're not particularly gaudy. They're nothing particularly fancy to look at. But the manner of their eating is something quite peculiar and something quite horrifying. They're generally captured. They're captured in nests. They come over from parts of Asia, and they're quite common across Europe. They're captured, they're gathered, they're placed into a dark container, a dark box, whereupon they think that it's nighttime, and because they think it's night and it's safe, they'll start to eat, and they'll start to eat, and they'll start to eat, and they'll gorge themselves, generally on millet and on grain. Once they've grown fat enough, they'll be gathered, they'll be picked up, scooped up, and they'll be thrown, engorged and fattened into buckets, into vats of armagnac, where they will drown. After the birds have drowned, they can be picked up, they can be served straight away, or traditionally they might be kind of packed and pickled into vats, and they'll be taken and then roasted and then served up as a very fine delicacy. And this has been something that's been going on for a very long time. It's been something that's been going on since Roman times. So it's been described as one of the kind of the cruelest dishes out there. It's a horrifying form of cuisine, but the manner of its eating reflects the horror around it. French gourmands for a while have been introducing and working with a mode of consumption that whenever people come and they go to a restaurant and they order ortolans, they'll also be given a very, very large napkin to lay over their head as they eat it. And there's been some idea that maybe having a big napkin over your head, like a big towel, is something that captures the aromas of the birds as you eat them. As you kind of take them, you hold the head in your mouth and you kind of eat them feet first. And remember, they're very little. But the more general idea is this is about shame, that although the birds might be tasty, the manner in which they have been captured and force-fed and killed is so completely horrifying that you need to have a napkin over your head to preserve yourself, to hide your face from God, from the shame of eating these little birds, and also to hide your face from the other people in the restaurant around you, because you will be eating these birds whole and spitting out large bones as you do so. So I want to talk about stigma today, and I want to talk about deviance. There can be an idea, particularly around designs and technologies and systems, that we work to some kind of greater norm. We work to things that are good, we design technologies that are good, we have some kind of perhaps empowering motive in mind, whether for a user, whether for a community, whether for an entire city. And stigma lets us kind of look at this through a very, very different angle. And it lets us think about where power runs through this and think about what's on the outside of this. Well, who gets to define what the normal systems are? What gets baked in as something which is acceptable and okay? And what happens when this stuff starts to sit there? So the idea of stigma comes back again from the Greeks, and it has a Latin root, and it basically means a mark, a stigma on the body. It has an origin in tattooing, or marking or branding those in the city that might be a slave, that might be kind of somehow kept to the house. And it would, by having this mark or brand on the body, this would designate the person with it as someone who was different. This was the stigma. You were other. You were not part of this at all. As the Roman army developed, a lot of the military people who came into it were mercenaries. And so they were also deemed to be, although they were there and they were fighting, they were also others. They were also not necessarily welcome in that space. So if you could brand them, and if someone tried to run off, then you would see that brand and you would know you are part of that group, and we designate you over there, so you are something different. More generally, it's been picked up as a way of thinking about something which is other or different. It's a mark of disgrace. So sociologists kind of picked up on this idea of the stigma, and they ran with it. And they said, well, look, if you've got, you can have people who are stigmatized, people who are seen as kind of devalued or spoiled or loathsome or flawed in some kind of way. They might be stereotyped, they might be discredited, they might be disgraced, they might be someone we want to put over there, they might be just someone just like, we don't want you near us, we don't want to think about what you're doing, just no. And this has resonance for the election last night, because the exit polls that came through at about 11 o'clock here last night showed a very large upswing to Conservative voters in the UK. And this had not been shown in any of the kind of the previous exit polls. And one of the theories around this is this idea of shy Tory syndrome, that people are so ashamed in the UK of voting right-wing that when the initial kind of polls come through and they're asked, how are you going to vote? What are you going to do? No one will really admit at that point to voting Conservative. So when you start to get the exit polls through right at the very end, you tend to get a massive upswing of all these people who are too ashamed to say what they were voting. And this is quite a UK-specific thing, and we were talking last night about this in the bar, that perhaps in somewhere like the US or somewhere else, the shame might fall to a different political class. And this is the other thing as well, that shame and stigma are socially constructed. What is seen as shameful and what is seen as different and what is seen as deviant varies massively space by space. It's not necessarily anything intrinsic about the person. It's about the mark that you place on them and say, that, you are different over there. So, okay, we have people who are stigmatized, but we also have jobs that are stigmatized, and we have institutions that are stigmatized, and we have technologies that are stigmatized, and we have practices and forms of behavior that are stigmatized. And so we have all these different things that have this kind of otherness and difference built into them to say that over there is not like this thing over here. That is not legitimate. That is not okay. We're not okay with this at all. One of the earlier examples of stigma, particularly around occupations that came through the sociological research, was the idea of butchers, which again, because you're working with meat, you're working with blood, you're working with bodies, potentially there's a lot of dirt, there's a lot of offal, you're dealing with the parts of the animal that might not ever make it through to the customer in some kind of clean, discreet way, carefully laid out on a slab. You're actually doing all the really grim, dirty work in the back room that no one really wants to think about. That butchers, at the time of writing in the early 1960s, were seen as some kind of, you don't hang around with them. Just, no. Would you want your son to become a butcher? No, you don't. You just keep that over there. And butchers found their own pride, the researchers showed, because they used very sharp and very shiny tools, and they had kind of a pride in their work, a pride in what they were doing, and that was how they kind of held on to their sense of identity in terms of what they were doing. So there are forms of kind of resistance, and there are things which happen around technology and stigma and deviance, which when we start to think about this in a kind of structural, systemic infrastructure space, gets quite interesting quite quickly. Because you're having to think about the space that stuff moves in. What happens when an object is in the world? What happens, again, when you're opening that front door? What happens when you're being given an artifact and told to work with it? And what are the deviant behaviors that start to get baked into that? So, if something is stigmatized, and if something is deviant, and if something is different, what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with your identity in the world? The first thing you can do is you can hide. If no one wants to see you, if you're aware that what's going on is perceived to be abhorrent, you can kind of hide and bundle yourself away so that no one will ever look at you. And there's something quite interesting about this in the way that surveillance technologies and cameras and voice recorders get hidden into objects as this kind of idea that we broadly know that filming people without their permission, without their consent, that's kind of not okay. That there's not an acceptable part of that. There's not something, if you're not admittedly saying, yeah, can we engage in this kind of process? It's not okay. So the way that cameras kind of get locked into hardware in particular is these little tiny things, these kind of tiny pinpricks. You look for the kind of the circles in metal, whether it's in a train station, whether it's in a photo booth, whether it's somewhere entirely unexpected. It's not there kind of shouting to the world, hey, I'm recording you. It's just there and locked away as something very, very small and very, very hidden. And particularly, again, at large-scale kind of civic-level infrastructure devices and pervasive devices, unless you know what you're looking for, it's very, very hard to see these hidden things. So Luca Introna and David Wood, particularly when they're talking about algorithmic surveillance devices, describe these as silent technologies, things that are hidden, things that are embedded, things that are passive. They might be obscure in their operational form or function. Unless you know they're there, they're completely below the surface. There's something kind of this deviant activity is kind of sealed off very, very neatly. And they talk about this in terms particularly of facial recognition technologies for smart CCTV. They're often embedded into existing networks. It makes its operation very, very difficult to detect. It's passive, and so again, it requires no participation, no consent at all. And it's operationally obscure. They describe this as saying that the code is hidden inside some proprietary object, so you don't generally often get a chance to pick at it and unbundle it and go, that's the thing hiding out in the light, it's just there. And so these little kind of things kind of hide their deviant behavior, what they're doing, just something, this tiny pinprick. But hiding isn't always like an easy option. It's not always practical either. Sometimes you need this thing to be out in the world, particularly if you're trying to bring an object or a structure into an open space and say, look, here it is. We need someone to buy this. We need someone to work with this. So Rachel Maines describes this idea of socially camouflaged technology. These are commodities whose use might be illegal, or they might just be socially unacceptable. And the use around them exists in this weird grey market space where the manufacturer might know what it's being used for, the consumer probably knows what it's being used for, but due to kind of social norms, you can't either of you really on both sides say, I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to use it in this way. One of the examples she gives is during the Prohibition, the way that copper stills were marketed in magazines. Distilling alcohol was illegal, but distilling water was fine. So you have these adverts for these huge, beautiful copper stills with this fantastic lurid copy that says, yeah, this is the best copper kettle. This will distill your water perfectly. If you distill your water in this kettle, it's going to be brilliant. And they were clearly used for moonshine. They were clearly used for alcohol. But there had to be this kind of concealing in it to say this is, we know and you know, but we can't actually say this openly, so we're just going to put this thing there and deal with it. Again, coming back to recording devices, there's some really interesting stuff that we were pulling together that was looking at the Wi-Fi video streaming cameras that come through things like drop cams. So this is it's a live stream that comes through a cloud-based service. It was bought last year by Google for $555 million. So it's a big business and it's a big deal. And the use case for this, which is presented, is one as kind of monitoring the home, surveilling the home, seeing what's there. So one of their founders has said that mothers are using it to catch their baby's first steps when they're not around, checking that older kids have arrived home safely, contracting children who are ignoring their cell phones, and sharing footage from birthday parties. But the adverts for this are really weird because this idea that people in it are being recorded without necessarily their knowledge or consent isn't really there. Instead, you have young children kind of running around a house, breaking things, throwing flour and paint everywhere, and then kind of admitting to the camera that Dropcam is always watching, even when my folks aren't in the room. So there's kind of this acknowledgement that there is this kind of extra role in it that being placed there, but no one's kind of quite specifically and explicitly talking about what that thing is. It's always very tacitly hidden. People don't say, we are doing this thing, we're putting this camera there, we're looking at it. So there is kind of an interpretation and a knowledge that needed to kind of required to understand the multiple uses of these technologies and who gets to pick them up and who gets to use them. And the multiple use thing, again, I mean, this is kind of a massive thing, particularly in military spaces, of how technologies that get developed by one particular group can have multiple forms of usage, some of which are deviant and some of which are not. So the defence industry is kind of a classic case of this. The skills and capabilities that get built up within an aeronautical engineering company allow them to build the planes that can be used for both civilian and military uses at the same time. But there are really important differences in the way that both a military object and a civilian object will be regulated, where it'll be procured, but also the culture around it. The organisations such as Boeing and Airbus have talked about how difficult they find it sometimes to recruit because they have both the military identity and they have the civilian identity as well, and it depends what framing they're putting on it. And even if you have the same kind of object, the regulation around it differs massively. So the military planes that fly around the UK, for example, are not subject to the same kind of noise restrictions as civilian planes, although they're broadly similar things. Military planes, if they're being used for training, tend to fly a little lower. Civilian planes tend to fly a little higher. But there's much, much stronger civic regulation around Heathrow, around Gatwick, around Stansted, about where these planes can fly and what they can actually do, even though, essentially, we're talking about very similar forms of technology. And even the planes themselves and the companies that build them have these multiple meanings kind of cooked into them. So the planes can be things that take us places. They can be things which are massively polluting. They can be representatives of the military-industrial complex. They can be beautiful bits of engineering. They have all these different things that are cooked into them and that are taken away by different parties depending on what they want, what meaning they take from the object itself. And some of these might be framed as socially legitimate, and some of them might be framed as deviant, but it's still ultimately, materially, it's the same thing, but the meanings change radically depending on who's using them. So something else that deviant technologies can do is they can try and legitimize themselves. They can try and move into a space in some form where there's been a deviant use, but then somehow through larger, more legitimate, more safe, more acceptable conventions, again, the same thing becomes something which is now okay to use. So there's this idea of outlaw innovation, forms of innovation which intentionally ignore legal or structural or moral grounds, that's been pulled together by an academic, Steve Flowers. And one of the things he talks about, the case that he makes, is that without Napster, you wouldn't have iTunes. Without this kind of initial service, which was shut down, you wouldn't have the thing that we have now. And the way that he breaks it down is saying initially this thing was launched in '99. It's the first major online file sharing service. And it kind of, we know this. People share music files. It led to allegations from the music industry of massive copyright violations. But it was hugely popular. And in 2001, at the beginning of 2001, it had 26.4 million users, so enormous. And then the cases came in. And then there were lawsuits, and then there were failed appeals, and then they were ordered to prevent the trading of the copyrighted music which was going between different users. And eventually, in July of that year, Napster shut down. But Flowers says, okay, so you have this thing which was shut down, which was, cracked down on enormously heavily by music companies. But what you have in that space is a demonstration that there's a need for this, that users will happily use this. A lot of the early users of Napster were college students because you had the internet flowing through college networks, they had computers, so you've got a massive kind of base there already kind of starting to pull up this stuff. It just happened, in massive scare quotes, to be enormously in violation of huge amounts of copyright. So when iTunes came along and said, well, that's the thing we're doing, but we're going to scaffold it in ways that are legitimate and ways which are okay, that's going to work, that's going to be fine. So it sometimes feels that for this, and this is kind of a narrative that I see a lot, that there's this need to kind of look towards these perhaps deviant technologies and maybe shine a light on them and try and flood transparency into the system to say, if we just knew what was going on, if we can just make these things clean, if we don't have these kind of obscure uses around them, if we can just make them neat, if we can make them tidy, if we can box them off in some way, that's going to be fine. And we can start to think about how they might be used in some kind of technology for good way. And this really makes me enormously uneasy because it kind of obscures the big power dynamics that start to run through why things are used in illegitimate ways, or why marginalized groups might choose to engage in things which are hidden, which do have multiple meanings, which do engage in weird kind of skewing forms of legitimacy. For the Ortolans, you can certainly say, well, that's the restaurant where they're being served, and that's the restaurant where they're being cooked up, and those are the chefs who do it, and those are the customers. But the implications of that are going to fall very, very differently on different parts of that chain itself. The customers who can afford to eat Ortolans are probably going to be fine. I mean, the people who would run large restaurants are probably going to be fine. The people who are engaged in forms of kind of more low-wage, precarious labor, a little less so. Again, we've had the election last night. The MPs that have been ousted, they're probably going to be fine. The people with enormous amounts of power, the people in larger structures, they're probably going to be fine. It's people who are kind of have less access to power, less access to resources, that are less socially legitimate, that need to engage in these kind of spaces to figure out their own stuff and to work through it as well. And there's also the need as well to recognize what these structures are, like why and how people start to move through stigmatized spaces, what resources they've got to hand to start grabbing the stuff in and hauling it in, rather than trying to offer these nice pre-packaged solutions which offer up something clean and offer up something very, very shiny, but don't necessarily offer up something that's useful, particularly for groups that might be needing to kind of keep quiet, keep over there, just keep below the radar, just kind of make use of the resources that they have to hand, rather than being offered something quite shiny as well. So this is one of the things that particularly comes out, particularly with talk of young people and technology, is this idea that they're kind of migrating to places where they can get to hide and they can get to just stay out of sight. And all the slides for this, by the way, have come from the Wellcome Trust image collection, and this was the one that I pulled up when I Googled for Facebook, so I was quite pleased about that. There's this idea that a lot of the young people, who they're certainly marginalized, they don't necessarily have power, but they have to live in the world. You have to live in the world. You have to operate within it. And so there's still a lot of use of these kind of quite public social media technologies, ones which have had a lot of rhetoric around them, around data gathering, around co-option, around appropriation, and around these places that should not be used, and yet they're still very widely used. And it's not necessarily because young people are mugs or idiots, but because they're hugely practical. These are the structures that exist. This is what is there. That's widely spread. There's 90% of 16 to 29-year-olds still use spaces like Facebook. And they know, right? They know that it's not cool. And they know their families are on there. And they know that they're going to be looked at. But they still need to use them because that's where their friends are. And that's where their families are. And it's a structure, it's a necessary structure to move into, but to negotiate and present different forms of identity within this space. So researchers who look around young people talk about how in these spaces young people present and perform a kind of an appropriate version of themselves because they know that they have to work there, and they know that the tools, for example, if you want to invite over 100 people to something, it's kind of useful to be able to do that in that space. They know they're going to be looked at. So what they share and they talk about in these spaces kind of relies on a pre-existing context. So there's in-jokes, there's references that only people will understand. There's a form of social camouflage, because if you have to live in these structures, if you have to work within them, then you have to find the ways to mediate them, to find this kind of canny navigation, because that's what the world is. That's the kind of the structures that already exist. Rather than having, again, to get to grips with something new, to learn how to use something as the only ways of using it, rather than kind of working with what's already there. Mary Gray, who's another researcher, when she talks about LGBT youth, says that social media it's often demonized, but it's great. It can be fantastic. And again, not in any unproblematic way. All the issues around control and identity and data still persist, but they're layered into this kind of this trade-off, this shared understanding that it's a space where people can tell stories, can allow connections to wider communities, but not in any kind of hurrah, big understanding, fantastic flags type way, but in a way that can be quite mediated, that can draw on people presenting different facets of themselves, different names, different photos, just as a way to kind of try and slip between the cracks, get into the niches of these spaces, and try and make the spaces work for them, rather than being given something whole and lumpen which doesn't allow any flexibility in its interpretation. And the problem of kind of flexibility and interpretation comes up, again, particularly around sexual healthcare, which is one of the areas that I research on. And again, this is kind of, for people who are working in this area, who are trying to deliver services, this can be nightmarishly difficult to negotiate. It's something that can be enormously shameful. People are profoundly embarrassed about talking about it. There's big legal structures around it as well. The early cases where barbers would ask men who came to visit them if they'd like anything for the weekend, referring to contraceptives, wasn't necessarily out of shame, but because it was illegal to actually talk about it in that way. So you have to find kind of new codes and new languages for talking about things. So again, if you're trying to offer sexual health care, you can't necessarily just offer up something and say, this is a predefined device for you and we give it to you and it's space ambivalent, it's space agnostic. It has to kind of fit into, well, we understand that the home has this kind of meaning, so we're going to try and figure out a way of delivering a testing service, but one that's discreetly packaged to you. Or we understand that clubs are where things are happening, so we have to kind of find a way to deliver something which understands what the space of the club is and how that works as well. Or maybe it's happening in schools, so we have to find a way to use a language which is appropriate, but which does not cause embarrassment, but which is also can demystify and dematerialize a lot of what's going on. And it can go quite badly wrong as well when people try and impose in the design process new meanings onto deviant objects. In the UK, certainly for many years, there'll be a point in sex education where the representatives from companies such as Tampax would come in, the boys would be all sent off to play rugby because of the UK, and the girls would be kept behind in the hall. And there'd be a big talk, and they'd be talking about things like puberty, like menstruation, like sexual health. And then the girls would be given a kind of a pack, which would have things in it like tampons, but would also have in it a little box that you're meant to keep tampons in. And these things were meant to be discreet, and they were meant to deal with the stigma around menstruation. They were meant to be something that would be protective and private, so you can hide it, and girls could hide like the embarrassment around menstruation. The problem was these boxes were invariably bright pink, in the coding of the colours that came through Tampax. And they were like structurally, materially, they were great. They were made of really rigid plastic. They had like a distant hinge. They would hold four tampons. But they were firstly, they were bright pink. So they kind of went against any idea of what any 14-year-old girl would actually have carrying around with her. And secondly, everyone got given them at the same time. So there was this idea of this secret thing, this private thing that you can interpret in some way, was completely thrown out because every girl, 200 girls in one hall, would all know that if they saw anyone else, any other girl around school at any stage in the future carrying that pink box, it meant one thing. So the obscurity of the object was completely displaced by the fact that there'd been this very top-down intervention, this very kind of problem-solving way of, we will solve this for you, here is this secret thing, which is bright pink. This kind of brings me on to, I guess, a final point, perhaps a slightly irate point as well. One of the things when we talk about stigma, or stigmatized subjects like sexuality, like violence, like weaponry, like the police, like the military, a lot of these things are often talked about in kind of metaphorical terms. It's used as a framing. We talk about kind of sexing up objects. We talk about making them edgy. We talk about kind of weaponizing something. We talk about having this thing being, this fantastic kind of edgy and exciting thing, which captures the kind of the frisson of excitement that comes around stigmatized and devious things, but never actually gets below the surface to deal with what stigma and deviance actually is itself. So there can be talk again of trying to make these things interesting and exciting, but it doesn't really deal with the fact that actually on the ground, things which are stigmatized have a form. They work. They have to work and operate in certain spaces. They can't just be taken away from the kind of this heightened identity around them. To engage with a stigmatized subject or the deviant subject, you actually have to look at it quite closely and figure out what's going on and figure out how these systems actually operate and not just take away this top scraping of glitter. Rather than this kind of this edginess that I kind of feel has been coming up quite excessively as a way of kind of legitimizing and co-opting some of this difficult stuff, particularly when we're talking about shiny new systems, things that look magnificent, but don't necessarily at the systemic and structural level offer much to anyone who is not within what are bounded as the norms of behavior of what you can see. And there's a big PowerPoint here as well. A lot of the kind of social justice and I guess technology for good stuff can focus on kind of individual rights and data rights, but not necessarily on more wider social justice implications of how this stuff works, not necessarily on what it means at a wide level when something is constructed as deviant and is pushed out. It's worth remembering that one of the things that came out of the Ed Snowden revelations was this idea that one could gather information on one's enemies or ones that we're hoping to discredit simply by looking at their pornography habits. So trying to invoke a stigmatized subject as a way of discrediting through these networks themselves. And stigmatized stuff isn't necessarily that edgy. It's really mundane. It's really difficult. It's actually really hard to talk about here without kind of giving lots of fantastic cases of going, this is how the stigmatized or deviant group does something about it. Because then you have this grand revelation, and then you unveil the meaning of what is behind that little pink plastic box, or what that thing actually is. So I guess I want to argue here for in this space when we're talking about things having very clearly defined meanings, a very specific use case, a very explicit form of transparency, a very tight, operationalized way of moving through the world. I kind of want to push here a little bit more for a politics of obfuscation, or at least a recognition that objects are flexible and they're fluid and they're going to have multiple meanings, whoever takes them on. As Warren said earlier, the home can be a place of safety, of hiding, of many other things, that the things that we bring into it are going to be interpreted and used in lots and lots of other ways, and some of those things are not going to be necessarily seen as acceptable, but they might be necessary, and they might be essential for survival. There might be ways in which these objects, these systems, these structures that get built offer really unknown and really strange and really new ways of persisting and surviving, particularly for those who are marginalized. So transparency itself isn't necessarily that's going to embolden all of us. It might just create forms of shame that can be then reflected back onto us instead. We need to think about how we understand what the power is behind the napkin that gets laid over our head and what the politics are of the wider system in which the little birds themselves are actually eaten. So thank you.